Red Mesa, New Mexico Territory. High noon in the summer of 1887. The whip struck, but Clara raised her dust-covered face and hissed, "5 men? And you're still afraid of one woman?" Gideon Vale coldly signaled another blow, until a gunshot split the whip handle. A stranger stepped forward, his eyes deadly calm. "Touch her again, and you'll go through me." This is the story of the day the West's deadliest gunslinger forced an entire town to choose stay until the end. The bell above Red Mesa's courthouse began ringing 2 minutes past noon, when the heat had driven even the flies into shade. Its iron voice rolled over flat roofs, empty hitching rails, and the dusty road toward Mercy Spring. Shop doors opened. Men stepped from the saloon with unfinished whiskey. Ranchers who had come for feed stopped pretending they did not know why Gideon Vale had ordered the bell rung. By the time Boone Lasker dragged Clara Whitmore from the telegraph office, nearly 100 people had gathered. Her hat was gone, her chestnut hair had fallen loose, and dust marked one side of her face, where someone had thrown her down. Boone's 4 men, Wade Harlan, Curtis Voss, Lem Pike, and Roy Danner, surrounded her with coiled rawhide whips. Clara stumbled once, caught herself, and lifted her chin before anyone could mistake pain for surrender. Gideon Vale waited beneath a white awning on the courthouse steps, untouched by the sun baking everyone else. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his dark suit looked as crisp as if he had dressed in winter. Sheriff Amos Bell stood below him, with both hands near his belt, though his eyes would not settle on Clara. "Clara Elise Whitmore," Vale announced, "you have been found in possession of confidential bank information, guilty of falsifying territorial messages, and responsible for encouraging lawful debtors to resist their contracts." A murmur moved through the crowd, then died when Boone faced them. Clara twisted against Wade's grip. "You mean I read the numbers you hoped no one would read? You mean I told the Drywells families their contracts were written to steal their land?" Vale's pale eyes narrowed. "You were offered a private hearing. You offered me silence." Tom Rusk, a rancher whose cattle had gone 3 days without water, stepped forward before his wife caught his sleeve. The widow, Hannah Mercer, pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. Clara had written letters, sent for medicine, and balanced freight accounts for half the families watching her. None of that outweighed the mortgages locked inside Vale's bank. "This town cannot survive disorder," Vale said. "Miss Whitmore has stolen records and spread lies concerning Mercy Spring. The council has authorized a citizen's punishment in place of imprisonment." Clara turned to Amos. "Show me the warrant." His face tightened. "The council acted under emergency authority." "There is no such authority, Clara. Don't make this worse." Her laugh held no humor. "You let 5 armed men drag me through the street, and you're asking me not to make it worse?" Vale descended 1 step. "Tell us where you hid Elias Whitmore's ledger. Confess that your father altered the original survey, and this ends now. The true accusation lay exposed." 12 years had passed since Clara's father came home in a pine box, his death called a wagon accident in Bitter Creek. 12 years of changed property lines, missing pages, and men lowering their voices when she entered a room. Beneath the brass key table in her office, inside a false panel Elias had built, rested the ledger Vale wanted. "My father did not alter the Mercy Spring survey," she said. "He discovered that you did." Vale's hand closed around the silver head of his cane. Clara saw it and knew she had struck truth. "Mercy Spring belongs to this town. The ranch deeds were rewritten after my father died. Your accounts contain payments to the men who changed them." The crowd stirred again. Vale nodded to Boone. The foreman dragged Clara to the old hitching rail beside the dry public trough. Once, travelers had tied horses there while drawing water freely. Since Vale fenced the spring, the trough held only sand. Wade and Curtis forced Clara's arms over the rail and bound her wrists. She fought until Lem drove a knee behind her leg. Boone uncoiled his whip slowly, making certain everyone saw it. 5 men, Clara said, glancing toward Vale. "Were you afraid one might fail?" Boone struck before Vale answered. The crack crossed the square. Clara's breath vanished, but she swallowed the cry rising in her throat. Wade followed, then Curtis. With each blow, the world narrowed to heat. Dust, rawhide, and familiar faces turned silent. She saw Amos look away. That wounded her more deeply than the whip. Jonah Rourke entered Red Mesa from the western road as another blow fell. He had planned to water his bay gelding, buy oats, and leave before sundown. Towns had become places he crossed rather than entered, and he distrusted bells rung at noon. He dismounted near the general store and studied the square. 5 armed men, 1 woman tied to a rail, a sheriff standing still, a banker conducting cruelty like a business meeting. Jonah's right hand hung loose beside the charcoal coat, concealing his revolver. He had seen public punishments before, some lawful and most not. Then Clara raised her head. A brass survey compass hung from a broken chain at her waist. Its lid bore a small engraved W surrounded by 8 points. Elias Whitmore had carried that compass through Bitter Creek. Jonah stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. Boone struck again, and Clara's knees buckled against the rail. Through dust and pain, she saw a stranger move through the crowd. A lean man with gray at his temples, a scar near his jaw, and a stillness that made everyone else seem nervous. He did not shout. He simply came closer until Boone noticed him. "Keep walking, Drifter." Jonah's gaze moved from Clara's bound hands to the compass and then to Vale. "Cut her loose." Vale studied him as though measuring an unexpected expense. "This matter does not concern you. 5 men beating a tied woman concerns anyone still willing to call himself a man." Boone lifted the whip. "We found ourselves a preacher." Jonah watched the weapon. "Raise it again, and you'll lose it." Boone smiled. "You planning to take it?" "No," Jonah said. "You're going to drop it." Boone's arm snapped forward. Jonah's revolver cleared leather so smoothly that most people saw only the result. The shot cracked beneath the bell. Boone staggered, staring at the whip handle split below his fingers. The leather lash twisted harmlessly into the dust. No blood marked him. Jonah lowered the gun and walked between Clara and the 5 men. "The next person who raises a hand against her answers to me." Wade reached for his pistol. Jonah struck his wrist before the gun cleared leather, caught his collar, and drove him across the dry trough. Curtis charged from the left. Jonah hooked his arm and threw him into Boone. Lem rushed with a knife. Jonah's boot struck his forearm, sending the blade spinning, as Lem fell backward into the empty horse trough. Roy Danner was young enough to hesitate. He froze with his hand on his gun. Jonah looked at him. "Don't." Roy swallowed and raised both hands. Boone shoved Curtis aside and grabbed the barreled rifle leaning against the rail. Jonah fired again. The rifle jumped from Boone's grasp, its stock exploding near the trigger guard. Fear crossed Boone's scarred face. Jonah had killed no one, yet the 5 men stood as completely beaten as if bodies covered the street. Clara felt Wade release the rope. She forced herself upright. "My hands," she said. Jonah kept watching Boone. Someone cut her loose. No one moved. Clara looked directly at Amos, sheriff. Shame passed over his face. He crossed the square, drew a knife, and severed the rope around her wrists. Vale's cane struck the courthouse step. "Sheriff Bell, arrest that man." Amos looked from Clara to Jonah and then at the scattered weapons. "For what charge? Assault, destruction of property, and interference with lawful punishment." Jonah faced Amos. "Show me the warrant authorizing 5 hired guns to whip a citizen." Amos's jaw tightened. "The council approved. A council vote is not a warrant." Jonah holstered his revolver and several people breathed again. "Either arrest all 6 men involved in an unlawful beating, or admit the badge as decoration." Boone pushed upright. "You don't know who you're talking to." Jonah's gaze settled on the burn scar covering Boone's right hand. Something old stirred behind his eyes. "I know enough." Boone stared back, suspicion slowly replacing anger. Vale saw the exchange and descended the remaining steps. "You possess neither standing nor protection in this town," Jonah replied. "Then your men should have had no trouble with me." Dr. Miriam Hale arrived with a black medical bag and enough anger to clear a path. She pushed past Roy and knelt beside Clara. "How many enough?" Clara whispered. Miriam checked her eyes and pulse, then faced the crowd. "If she remains here, she may die." Jonah knew the statement was harsher than the injuries justified, but the doctor understood public fear. Hannah Mercer began to cry. Tom Rusk said, "Let the doctor take her." Other voices joined him. Vale's authority did not break, but it bent enough for Amos to act. "Miss Whitmore will remain under medical supervision," he announced. "The stranger will be available for questioning." Jonah turned to Clara. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She took one step and nearly fell. "He caught her. I said I could walk." "You were mistaken. Put me down." Miriam pointed toward her clinic. "Carry her." Carefully. The clinic stood 3 streets away, but the walk felt longer beneath the watching windows. Jonah carried Clara with one arm beneath her knees, and the other behind her shoulders, careful not to touch the wounds. She remained rigid with anger at being seen helpless. "You enjoy ignoring women?" she asked. "Only when they're about to fall." That was not permission. No. There was no mockery in the answer, only acknowledgement. At the clinic, Miriam directed him to a narrow treatment room. Jonah placed Clara on the bed and stepped away. Miriam cleaned and bandaged her shoulders while he waited beyond the half-open door. He heard no crying, only Clara's measured breathing. It reminded him of Elias Whitmore bleeding beside a broken wagon in Bitter Creek, trying to say his daughter's name while gunsmoke drifted through the canyon. An hour later, Clara sat against the pillows in a clean shirt draped over the bandages. Jonah stood near the window, watching the alley. Miriam handed her water and said, "You are not returning to work today." Clara ignored her. "Where is my office key?" Pain stopped her as she tried to rise. Jonah did not move to help, she noticed. "Vale's men searched my office. They will search again." Jonah's eyes settled on the brass compass beside her folded skirt. "That belonged to Elias Whitmore." Clara went still. "How do you know my father's name?" "I knew him." "Where?" Jonah looked toward the alley. "A long time ago." "That is not an answer. It's the one I have today." Clara's fingers tightened around the cup. "You arrive when Vale orders me beaten, recognize my father's compass, and refuse to explain yourself." "Were you sent here?" "No." "Then why did you step forward?" she demanded. Jonah considered the question. "Because no one else did." The words struck harder than an accusation. Miriam lowered her eyes. Clara remembered every face in the square. "Do not use what happened to me to settle an old score." Pain passed briefly across Jonah's face. "If I wanted to settle an old score, Boone Lasker would be dead." Clara had not heard anyone give Boone's full name. "You know him too." Jonah glanced at the rifle Amos had allowed him to keep after declaring him available for questioning. "I know the kind of man he is, and my father?" "I knew the kind of man he was." Before Clara could press him, Miriam lifted her discarded sleeve and felt paper crackle inside the cuff. She drew out a narrow strip of telegraph paper, folded twice. Clara took it. The strip held the final message she had transmitted before Boone entered her office. "Whitmore records confirm false survey. Send Federal Examiner." Jonah read it without touching it. "Who received this?" "The Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, unless Vale's operator intercepted it." "Were you expecting a reply?" "Yes." Jonah looked toward the window. "Then Vale will cut the wire." Clara pushed upright despite Miriam's protest. "Not before I hear what came back. You cannot walk 3 streets. I can operate a key sitting down." Jonah recognized that command would fail. "Vale's men will watch the office. Then make yourself useful a second time." Near sunset they returned. In Miriam's small wagon, Clara hidden beneath a traveling cloak. Jonah entered the telegraph office first. Drawers had been overturned, papers scattered, and the brass key bent but intact. Clara lowered herself into the operator's chair. Beneath the table, behind the false panel, her father's ledger remained untouched, but she did not reveal it. She straightened the key and tested the circuit. At first, there was only the electrical hiss of an open line. Then the sounder clicked. Clara leaned forward as a reply came from the northern relay. "Territorial office received partial." The key died mid-word. Jonah was already moving. From the rear alley, Hoofbeats hammered away. He reached the door in time to see two riders vanish beyond the freight yard, one carrying wire cutters. He did not fire. "They cut it?" Clara asked when he returned. "North side." Then someone received part of my message. And Vale knows it. Night settled over Red Mesa as they returned to the clinic by back streets. The broken whip handle still lay beside the hitching rail, but Clara would not look at it. Jonah remained outside after Miriam barred the door, studying the roofline, alley, and dark windows across the street. Near midnight, he entered. Clara was awake with her father's compass clenched in one hand. "You said Vale would attack again before nightfall," she whispered. "I was wrong." A rifle fired from across the alley. The window burst inward, throwing glass across the room. Jonah overturned a table to shield Clara and Miriam. A second bullet punched through the adobe wall above the bed. Then silence returned. The shooter had never intended to enter. Jonah dug the flattened bullet from the plaster with his knife. A paper scrap had been wrapped around it. Miriam lit another lamp while Clara forced herself to sit. Jonah unfolded the note. Block letters had been pressed deep into the paper. "Bitter Creek should have buried you." For the first time since entering Red Mesa, his control slipped. His face emptied as though he were looking into a place no one else could see. Clara watched his fist close around the message. "You were there," she said. He did not deny it. Outside, a horse moved softly through the darkness. Jonah checked the revolver at his hip and looked through the shattered window. "Vale isn't only hunting your ledger," he said. "He's finishing a killing that started 12 years ago." Jonah remained beside the shattered clinic window until the street fell completely silent. The rifleman had chosen his position well, firing from an upper storeroom across the alley before escaping through the rear yards. Following him in darkness would mean leaving Clara and Miriam unguarded, which was likely the purpose of the attack. Jonah folded the warning and placed it inside his coat. "We leave before dawn," he said. Miriam stood over the overturned table with a lantern in one hand. "She cannot ride. Then we use a wagon." Clara pushed the blanket from her knees. Pain crossed her face, but she forced herself upright. "I am not being carried out of my own town like stolen freight." Jonah turned from the window. "Vale knows where you are. Boone knows where you are. By sunrise, every road may be watched." "Then we leave before sunrise," she replied. "But I go through my office first." Miriam opened her mouth to object, then stopped. She knew Clara well enough to recognize the difference between stubbornness and necessity. "5 minutes," she said. "You will wear the gray cloak and keep your face covered." Jonah extinguished the front lamps, while Miriam packed bandages, medicine, bread, and 2 canteens. Clara dressed slowly in a dark skirt and high-collared blouse that concealed most of the fresh bandages. Every movement pulled against the wounds across her back. But she refused Jonah's hand when he offered it. He did not offer twice. Just before the eastern sky began to pale, Miriam led a mule wagon into the rear alley. Clara lay beneath a canvas sheet beside sacks of flour. Jonah rode behind them, keeping to the shadows cast by the adobe buildings. Somewhere near the saloon, a man coughed. A dog barked once and went quiet. They reached the telegraph office without being challenged. The lock had been broken during the previous search, and the door sagged inward when Jonah touched it. 2 minutes, he said. Clara lifted the cloak from her head. "You said 5. I changed my mind. That appears to be one of your habits." She entered before he could answer. The room smelled of hot dust, machine oil, and splintered wood. Every drawer had been emptied, but the men who searched the office had looked for something large enough to steal and obvious enough to hide. Clara lowered herself beside the brass key table and pressed a narrow catch beneath the rear support. A wooden panel slid free. Inside lay a dark red ledger wrapped in oilcloth. She held it against her chest for a moment, then placed it in Miriam's medical bag. Clara copied the incomplete territorial reply onto a clean strip of paper. Territorial office received partial. Nothing more had come before the wire was cut. She slipped the paper into the ledger and replaced the panel. Jonah watched from the doorway. It is what he thinks he wants. Meaning? Meaning my father rarely wrote anything plainly. She looked toward the front window, where the first weak light touched the dust. The ledger contains freight totals, weather reports, bank drafts, and survey references. Vale believes it proves something. I have spent 12 years trying to determine what. Hoofbeats sounded at the far end of the street. Jonah reached for the medical bag. Clara held it tighter. I carry it. You can barely stand. That does not make it yours. Their eyes met. After a moment, he nodded. Then keep it close. Sheriff Amos Bell stood beneath the overhang of the general store as the wagon passed. His coat was unbuttoned, and he looked as though he had not slept. Miriam kept the mule moving. Clara remained hidden beneath the canvas, while Jonah rode on the wagon's left side, one hand resting near his revolver. Amos saw them. Jonah knew it from the slight turn of the sheriff's head. For several seconds, the two men looked at each other across the empty road. Amos could have shouted. He could have reached for his rifle or summoned Vale's guards from the bank. Instead, he removed his hat and studied the ground. The wagon rolled beyond him. Clara lifted the canvas only after they reached the western edge of town. Did he see us? Yes. Why did he let us go? Jonah watched Red Mesa disappear behind a veil of dust. A man can be frightened and ashamed at the same time. High Mesa Station lay 12 miles west, where the stage road climbed between sandstone ridges and dead juniper. The relay post had been abandoned after the southern stage line shifted closer to the railroad survey. Its roof leaned, its stable doors hung loose, and the old well had gone bitter, but the station offered stone walls and a view of every approach. By mid-morning, the heat shimmered above the road. Clara's fever rose with it. She sat rigid in the wagon, holding the medical bag in her lap until her strength failed and she sagged against the sideboard. Jonah stopped beneath a narrow strip of shade. We rest. We keep moving. That fever says otherwise. My fever does not know. Vale. Jonah tied his horse to the rear rail. Your fever does not need to. He lifted her from the wagon before she could argue. But this time he warned her first. I am going to carry you. Clara's eyes sharpened. That is not a request. No, it is notice. She almost smiled despite herself. Jonah carried her inside the station and set her on an old cot near the stone wall. Miriam removed the bandages and inspected the wounds. No infection yet, she said, but that will change if she keeps behaving, as though pain is a personal insult. Clara drank water and glared at both of them. Jonah went outside without comment. He repaired the stable latch, covered the wagon tracks with a branch, and climbed the western ridge to study the road. When he returned, he found Clara awake and Miriam preparing to leave. You are going back? Clara asked. Miriam tied her medical bag closed, leaving the ledger beside Clara. Vale will notice if the only doctor in town vanishes. I can help you better from Red Mesa. He may arrest you. Then I will be the first physician jailed for treating a patient. Miriam took Clara's face between her hands. Do not confuse surviving with winning. Rest long enough to do both. She then faced Jonah. If her fever worsens, use the quinine in the green bottle. If the wounds darken, bring her back regardless of what she says. You speak as though I am not here, Clara muttered. Miriam kissed her forehead, because you are impossible when you are. Jonah escorted Miriam to the wagon and watched until she disappeared into the canyon. The station felt larger after Miriam left. Wind moved through gaps in the roof, carrying the dry smell of sage. Jonah made a fire in the old kitchen, heated beans, and found 2 dented tin cups. He placed Clara's food within reach and sat on the opposite side of the room. She noticed that he never came closer than necessary. Even while changing the bandage Miriam had left loose, he turned his back and waited until Clara said she was finished. You have done this before, she said. Hidden people, waited outside rooms. That was not my question. Jonah examined the door hinge. I had a wife once. The words came without invitation and seemed to surprise him. Clara watched his shoulders become still. What happened to her? She died. He offered nothing more. Clara understood that pressing him would close whatever door had opened. By afternoon, the fever eased. Clara carried the red ledger to a table beneath the western window. Its leather cover had been rubbed smooth by Elias Whitmore's hands. Columns of numbers filled the pages in his precise script, accompanied by weather notations, freight weights, and abbreviations. Jonah stood at a distance until she said, "You may look." He approached, but did not touch the book. Clara pointed to 3 repeated sets of initials. GV appears beside entries marked as freight payments. AB appears near court dates. BL appears in the weeks before my father died. Jonah's expression changed at the last letters. Boonlasker. You knew that already. I suspected it. You seem to suspect a great deal without explaining any of it. Jonah looked through the window toward the empty road. I was a federal deputy before Bitter Creek. Clara studied him. She had expected an outlaw's confession or a hired gun's excuse. Not that. My father worked with federal officers. He did. Were you assigned to him? Jonah's silence answered. He crossed to his saddlebag and removed a folded piece of canvas. From inside it, he drew half of a weathered survey map. The paper had been torn diagonally, from one corner to the other. Red ink marked ridges, springs, and property boundaries. Clara rose too quickly and caught the table for support. Where did you get that? Your father gave it to me. She took the map with shaking fingers. Along the margin, written in faded pencil, was Elias's habit of forming the number 7 with a line through its center. No one else wrote it that way. This is his hand. Jonah remained across the table. He gave it to me at Bitter Creek. Clara looked up. You said you knew him. You did not say you were there when he died. I was. The room seemed to narrow around them. How? There was an ambush. By whom? Men hired to stop him from reaching Santa Fe. Vale's men? Jonah's gaze moved to the initials in the ledger. Some of them. Clara pressed the torn map flat. And my father? He did not survive. That is what the undertaker told me. Her voice sharpened. I am asking what happened. Jonah's jaw tightened. I will tell you, but not while we may have riders within an hour of this place. You have had 12 years. He accepted the blow without flinching. Clara hated him for that calm almost as much as she needed the truth behind it. She turned back to the map. Several coordinate numbers matched entries in the ledger, though they appeared under freight headings. A payment marked as 32 crates of lamp oil corresponded to a parcel transferred from the Mercer Ranch. Another entry recorded 12 axle assemblies on the same date. Vale's company gained control of a northern water channel. These are not freight totals, she whispered. They are payments. Jonah leaned closer. To whom? I do not know yet. She traced a series of figures, but each payment appears beside a land change. My father disguised the transactions inside ordinary shipping accounts. They worked for nearly 2 hours, comparing the map's survey lines with Clara's memorized knowledge of ranch boundaries. Respect grew between them, not through softness, but through usefulness. Jonah remembered trail distances, abandoned wells, and the location of county markers. Clara recognized altered claim numbers and dates that matched foreclosures. Neither spoke of trust. They behaved as though trust were a bridge made one plank at a time. When Clara's hand began to shake, Jonah closed the ledger. Enough. She reopened it. Vale controls the bank, the sheriff, and the water. We do not have time for enough. You will have less time if the fever returns. Do not order me. Jonah considered his answer. Then I advise you to rest. That sounds nearly civilized. Near sunset, Jonah climbed the ridge and saw dust rising on the southern trail. 4 riders moved in a loose line, using the rocks for cover. He returned to the station and barred the door. Company. Clara pushed herself up. Vale's men? Most likely. Jonah checked the rear window and counted ammunition. There is a wash behind the stable. You can reach the northern ridge from there. And leave you? Yes. No. This is not an argument we have time to enjoy. Clara looked through the cracked shutter. The riders had separated, 2 circling east and 2 west. They mean to surround the station. She scanned the room, noticing a rusted signal mirror hanging beside an old stage schedule. How many rifles do we have? 1 rifle and my revolver. Then let them believe we have more. Clara carried the mirror to the rear loft, ignoring the pull of her wounds. From the high window, sunlight still struck the western ridge. She angled the glass toward the rocks, flashing once, then twice. Jonah understood. He moved below the opposite window and fired a single shot into the dirt ahead of the nearest rider. Clara shifted the mirror and flashed again from another angle. The riders halted. Jonah crossed quickly to the stable and fired from there, creating the illusion of several defenders changing positions. One rider shouted that Rourke had men on the ridge. Another began retreating toward the wash. Clara flashed the mirror from a third location. Confusion spread faster than gunfire. One rider separated from the others and tried to approach through the dry creek bed. Jonah allowed him close, then dropped from the stable roof, behind him. The man turned too late. Jonah struck the pistol from his hand and forced him to the ground. The remaining riders fled south, convinced reinforcements were coming. Clara descended from the loft as Jonah brought the prisoner inside. He was young, sunburned, and frightened enough to answer before Jonah asked twice. Vale offered $500 for the woman alive, he said. 1,000 for you dead. Jonah tied his wrists. Why the difference? He said she knows where the book is. Said you only know how to kill. Clara placed the ledger beneath her cloak. What else? The prisoner looked at Jonah. Vale's foreclosing on dry wells. Every ranch. 10 days from now. Clara went still. Why 10 days? Railroad men are coming. Vale says the land has to be cleaned before they arrive. She turned toward the map. The proposed rail line had never been publicly confirmed, yet the threatened ranches formed a narrow corridor across the territory. He is buying the route before the announcement, she said. He made the ranchers dependent on his water, then raised their debts until they could not pay. Jonah watched anger replace exhaustion in her face. Can you prove it? Not yet. She touched the ledger. But my father may have. They released the prisoner, after taking his weapon and horse, warning him that returning with Boone would be his last mistake. Darkness fell quickly over High Mesa. Jonah checked the ridges again, while Clara copied the newly identified entries. Neither knew that one of the fleeing riders had already reached Red Mesa. In Vale's bank, Boone listened as the man described mirror flashes, rifle fire, and the capture. Gideon Vale stood behind his desk, turning a silver coin between his fingers. Rourke will not remain disciplined forever, he said. Burn the station, take the ledger. Bring Clara alive. Boone's scarred hand closed around the coin when Vale placed it on the desk. And Rourke? Vale's expression did not change. Make him kill someone where the town can see what he truly is. At High Mesa, Clara woke to the smell of smoke. Jonah was already at the door. Orange light pulsed through the cracks in the stable wall below. Flames climbed the dry timbers, spreading toward the wagon and the only safe trail down the ridge. Horses screamed inside the enclosure. Jonah seized the rifle and kicked open the rear door. Across the darkness, muzzle flashes appeared among the rocks. Boone's men had surrounded the station while they slept. Clara reached for the ledger as burning boards collapsed across the road. Jonah looked toward the narrow canyon behind the building and saw riders moving there as well. The stable roof fell in with a roar, sending sparks high above the mesa. Their safest escape route had become a wall of fire. The stable roof collapsed in a storm of sparks, and for a moment, the flames turned the night as bright as noon. Jonah caught the frightened bay by the bridle and cut its lead before the burning rail could trap it. Clara stood in the station doorway with the ledger beneath her cloak, fighting the instinct to shield her back from the heat. Rifle fire struck the stone beside her, scattering chips across the floor. The rear canyon is blocked, Jonah said. There is an old drainage channel beneath the kitchen. Clara remembered the station plans from freight records she had copied years earlier. It empties below the northern ridge. Can you crawl? Ask me when we reach the other side. Jonah released the horse through the smoke as a distraction, then overturned the kitchen table. Beneath it, almost hidden by dirt, lay an iron ring set into a trapdoor. The wood resisted, until Jonah drove his shoulder against it. Cold, stale air rose from the darkness below. Jonah lowered Clara first, though she insisted on keeping the ledger strapped against her body. The channel was barely high enough to crawl through, its stone floor slick with old mud and animal bones. Behind them, boots crashed into the station. Boone's voice carried through the smoke. "Rourke! There is nowhere left to run." Jonah pulled the trapdoor shut and followed Clara into the passage. She moved on hands and knees, biting back every sound as the rough stone scraped against her bandages. A beam overhead groaned when gunfire struck the kitchen floor. "Faster," Jonah whispered. They found the door. Clara felt along the wall until her fingers touched a rotten timber supporting loose earth. "This brace is failing." "Then do not touch it." She looked back through the darkness. "I am not trying to save it." A lantern appeared behind them, followed by the shadow of one of Vale's men entering the channel. Clara wedged her shoulder against the old timber and pushed. Pain tore across her back, but the brace shifted. Jonah reached for her. "Leave it, he will follow us." The pursuing man fired, the shot roaring inside the narrow tunnel. Clara pushed again. The beam split with a dry crack. Jonah seized her arm and pulled her forward as dirt and stone collapsed behind them. The lantern vanished beneath the falling earth, and the man's shout ended in coughing rather than death. Clara and Jonah crawled until the tunnel opened above a dry wash. They emerged beneath the northern ridge as the station burned behind them. Jonah helped her stand. "You could have brought the entire roof down, but I did not." He stared at her for a moment. "You calculate risks like a surveyor." Clara adjusted the ledger beneath her cloak. "I was raised by one." They traveled west on foot until Jonah caught the loose bay near dawn. Clara rode while Jonah led the horse through gullies that hid them from the main road. By sunset, St. Jude's Mission appeared beyond a grove of cottonwoods, its adobe walls glowing red beneath the last light. The mission had served travelers before Red Mesa existed, though now only an elderly caretaker, 2 sisters, and several orphan children remained. Miriam waited inside the courtyard with fresh bandages and a face sharpened by worry. "The station burned to the ground," she said. "Vale told the town you set it on fire while fleeing arrest." Clara dismounted slowly. "He is becoming predictable." Miriam embraced her carefully, then turned to Jonah. "And you? Still difficult to kill. Do not sound disappointed. I have enough patience." The mission archive occupied a cool chamber behind the chapel. Shelves held baptismal records, burial lists, old wills, and donation books written in Spanish and English. Clara had visited once as a child, but had never understood why her father spent entire afternoons studying the volumes. Now she placed the torn map beside the ledger and began searching for the earliest references to Mercy Spring. Jonah sat across from her, cleaning dust from his revolver. The children whispered about him from the doorway until Miriam sent them away. Near midnight, Clara found a leather-bound donation register dated 1859. The entry described a gift from the de Herrera family to the residents of the settlement, 1 spring, 2 stone channels, and common grazing access to remain for public use in perpetuity. Beside the description was the claim number 18 Red 7, the same number written along the torn edge of Jonah's map. Vale's company deed uses 18 Red 17, Clara said. 1 added digit turned public land into a private claim. Jonah examined the entry. Could it be a copying error? Not when the same altered number appears on every mortgage attached to the Dry Wells ranches. She traced the old ink with 1 finger. My father must have discovered the original donation. That is why he went to Bitter Creek. Jonah remained quiet. Clara closed the book. "No more partial answers. We need rest. You have used danger, distance, and my injuries to postpone this. None of them change what you know." The mission bell moved softly in the night wind. Jonah set the revolver aside. "Your father was gathering evidence against Vale and 2 officials in Santa Fe. I was ordered to escort him to a federal hearing. And the map? He divided it before we left Red Mesa." Clara studied his face in the lamplight. Did you kill him? The question sounded colder than she intended, but she did not take it back. Jonah's expression did not change. No, were you responsible for his death? I failed to prevent it. That is not the same answer. It is the only honest one I have. He told her that the escort party had entered Bitter Creek with 4 deputies, Elias, and a wagon carrying survey equipment. Gunmen waited above the canyon. The first shots killed the lead driver and 1 deputy. After that, the memory became smoke, echoes, and men firing from stone ledges. Your father was alive when I last saw him, Jonah said. He gave me the map and told me to ride. Clara's hand closed around the ledger. You left him. I believed I could draw the gunmen away. Did you? Some of them. His voice lowered. Not enough. Clara wanted to hate him. Hatred would have been easier than the grief in his eyes. Why did you not come to me? By the time I could return, Vale's people were watching your house. Anyone connected to Bitter Creek was disappearing. So you vanished for 12 years. Yes, and carried half my father's map while Vale stole this town. Jonah accepted the accusation in silence. Clara looked away first. She did not forgive him, but she believed him. A liar would have defended himself more carefully. We finish what he started, she said. After that, you will tell me everything. Jonah nodded. After that, you may decide what I deserve. Do not mistake me for a judge. I have met judges with less authority. Miriam returned from Red Mesa the following afternoon with news worse than they expected. Vale had charged Clara with attempted murder, claiming she ordered the attack at High Mesa and left one of his men buried in the drainage channel. The man had survived with a broken leg, but Vale omitted that detail. More troubling was the yellowed wanted poster displayed in the saloon. It showed a younger Jonah beneath the name Jonah Gabriel Rourke and described him as the surviving gunman of the Bitter Creek massacre. Vale is telling everyone Jonah murdered deputies and witnesses, Miriam said. 3 Drywell's families who promised to support Clara have withdrawn. Jonah folded the poster and handed it back. Then I leave tonight. Clara looked up from the donation register. No, my name gives Vale a weapon. He already has it. He can make your evidence look like the invention of an outlaw. Then we prove the evidence before he defines it. Clara proposed entering the courthouse during the next evening's town council meeting. Vale would expect her to remain hidden, and the records office would be lightly guarded. Jonah objected immediately. You can barely lift your left arm. Fortunately, land deeds are not stored on high shelves. If Boone sees you, protection without respect is another kind of cage. The words struck him harder than anger would have. Clara continued. You stepped between me and the whip because everyone else chose silence. Do not become another man who decides what I am allowed to risk. Jonah looked toward the chapel courtyard, where the children carried water in clay jars. I am trying to keep you alive. Then help me do what makes survival worth having. After a long silence, he said, we use your plan, but we leave the moment the building changes. Clara nodded. Agreed. That was an apology. It required clearer wording. They entered Red Mesa after dark in Miriam's medical wagon. Clara wore a plain gray dress and carried a basket of bandages, appearing to be Miriam's assistant. Jonah approached through an alley behind the courthouse, using a basement window described in an old freight inspection report. The town council meeting filled the main chamber with ranchers, merchants, and Vale's supporters. Through the thin walls, Clara heard Vale speaking about public safety and dangerous fugitives. Miriam deliberately interrupted him with questions about the wounded man from High Mesa, holding the room's attention. Clara slipped into the records corridor. Jonah met her beside the archive door after lifting the latch from inside. You were right about the window, he whispered. You sound surprised. I am learning not to be. The deed book smelled of dust, ink, and old leather. Clara found the Mercy Spring transfers first. The earliest record used claim number 18 Red 7, but the page had been marked void. Later deeds used 18 Red 17 and bore signatures from 3 county officials. She placed the documents side by side. The same hand wrote all three names. Jonah studied the flourished capitals. You can prove that. The downward stroke on every M leans left, and each final letter rises above the line. Three officials did not share the same hand. In a locked cabinet, Jonah found a private payment ledger stamped with Vale Bank's seal. Entries matched initials in Elias's book, GV, ABBL, and HV, Horace Venn, Clara whispered, the county recorder. A door opened behind them. Horace Venn stood in the passage, holding a pistol with both hands. He was a narrow, nervous man whose collar seemed too large for his neck. Put those books down. Jonah moved slightly in front of Clara. Do you intend to shoot us? I intend to call the sheriff. Clara lifted one altered deed, then explained why one person signed three officials' names. Venn's pistol trembled. Those are lawful copies. No, they are forgeries. This payment ledger shows Vale Bank paid you on the same dates the records changed. You do not understand. I understand that Mercy Spring belonged to the town until you added a single digit. The recorder's face collapsed. He lowered the pistol. Vale said, my family would be ruined. He said the original records were already gone. Are they? Clara asked. Venn looked toward the council chamber. There is an index book he never found. It lists every deed by the original claim number. Give it to us and testify, Clara said. Testify to whom? Amos belongs to Vale. The council belongs to Vale. A territorial examiner received part of my message. Venn's eyes widened. Hope appeared and disappeared almost at once. Federal protection, he said. For my wife and sons, we will ask for it. Jonah's gaze sharpened toward the basement. Someone is coming. The first shot burst through the archive door. Venn fell backward, blood spreading across his shoulder. Boone Lasker kicked the damaged door inward with Wade and Curtis behind him. Jonah fired into the lamp above them, plunging the archive into darkness. Clara dropped behind a cabinet and dragged Venn toward cover. Boone's rifle flashed twice. Books exploded from the shelves. Jonah moved between each shot, striking Wade from the side and sending him into the wall. Curtis seized the payment ledger and ran toward the stairwell. Boone grabbed a bundle of deed records from the table. Clara found the narrow index book Venn had indicated and slid it beneath the bandages in her medical basket. Jonah pursued Boone into the corridor. The foreman reached the outer door and turned his back while crossing the courtyard. Jonah raised his revolver, then lowered it. He would not shoot a fleeing man in the back. Boone glanced over his shoulder and saw the choice. His expression twisted with contempt. Still pretending you have a badge? The council meeting emptied into the square as Boone emerged carrying the stolen records. Clara and Miriam followed with the wounded Venn. Vale stepped onto the courthouse stairs and pointed toward Jonah. There is the criminal who attacked this office. Boone raised his voice so every person could hear. You people do not know him, do you? Ask him his name. Jonah came through the doorway with his revolver lowered. Boone smiled. Tell them, Jonah. Gabriel Rourke, an elderly rancher named Silas. Creed stared from beside the town bell. His face lost its color. Rourke, he whispered, the Bitter Creek gunman. The name passed through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Mothers pulled children closer. Men who had watched Jonah defeat 5 enforcers now reached toward their own weapons. Vale descended one step, turning fear into accusation. This is the man, Clara Whitmore, brought into Red Mesa. A killer blamed for the deaths of federal deputies, surveyors, and innocent travelers. Together they broke into the courthouse to steal lawful deeds. Clara lifted Venn's payment ledger, but Boone had taken it. All she held openly was a basket of bloodied bandages. Vale forged the land records, she shouted. Recorder Venn will testify. Venn tried to speak, then collapsed against Miriam. Vale looked at him with cold satisfaction. A frightened clerk wounded during a burglary is hardly a witness. Tom Rusk avoided Clara's eyes. 2 Dry Wells ranchers stepped away from her. Vale had given them a story easier to fear than the truth. Amos Bell arrived with 3 deputies but did not order anyone arrested. The square had become too uncertain. Miriam demanded passage to the clinic, and Amos allowed it. Inside, she cut Ven's coat away, while Clara removed the original deed index from the basket. Jonah stood near the rear door. "Vale is right about one thing," he said. "My name will poison every witness you find. So you intend to run again. I intend to draw Boone away and leave Vale to tell the town that your flight proves his accusations?" Jonah's silence confirmed it. Clara stepped closer despite the pain in her back. "You said my father trusted you with that map. If you leave now, Vale owns the story of Bitter Creek forever. Staying may get you killed. Leaving may do the same." Jonah looked at the woman who had endured the whipping post, crawled through a collapsing tunnel, and returned to a courthouse controlled by the man hunting her. He had once believed courage looked like a drawn gun and a man refusing to retreat. Clara's courage was quieter and more difficult. She chose where to stand after learning exactly what it might cost. "Then I stay," he said, "and I tell the truth." Before Clara could answer, Miriam called them to the treatment table. Ben's eyes had opened, though his skin had turned gray. He caught Clara's sleeve with his uninjured hand. "The final proof," he whispered. "Your father hid it." Clara bent close. "Where?" Ven's gaze drifted toward Jonah's torn map, where copper remembers every line. His hand went slack, and he fell unconscious before he could explain another word. Horace Venn remained unconscious through the night, while Miriam worked beneath the weak light of 2 oil lamps. The bullet had passed through the recorder's shoulder without striking bone, but he had lost enough blood to leave his skin cold and colorless. Clara sat beside the treatment table, with the deed index hidden beneath her cloak. Jonah stood near the shattered rear window, watching the alley while dawn slowly uncovered Red Mesa's rooftops. Ven's final words repeated in Clara's mind, where copper remembers every line. She opened the deed index and traced the original survey number with one finger. "A survey plate," she said. Jonah turned. "What?" "My father used copper plates when boundaries had to be preserved exactly. Ink fades, paper burns. A stamp plate keeps every line." Jonah looked at the torn map, then toward the western ridges. Recognition darkened his face. There was an assay office in Bitter Creek. Miriam washed the blood from her hands and crossed to a locked medicine cabinet. From behind several bottles, she removed a small metal box Clara had never seen. Inside lay an envelope stained brown along one corner and sealed with cracked red wax. Elias Whitmore's name was written across the front in his own hand. Clara stared at it without breathing. "He gave this to me 3 days before he left Red Mesa," Miriam said. "He told me to open it if he did not return." I was frightened. After his death, Vale's men searched homes and questioned everyone connected to him. I convinced myself keeping it sealed was the safest choice. Clara lifted the envelope. "For whom?" "For you." Her anger rose, but Miriam did not look away. "I failed you. I believed silence would keep you alive." The letter contained only 2 pages. Elias warned that the Mercy Springs survey had been altered, and that a duplicate copper plate had been hidden near the old Bitter Creek assay office. He wrote that the plate alone would not prove who arranged the fraud. It had to be compared with his freight ledger and the original donation record. Near the bottom of the second page, he mentioned Deputy Jonah Rourke by name. Clara folded the letter before reading the final paragraph. "Tell me everything first," she said. Jonah's gaze rested on the paper. "You should finish it." "No. I want the truth from you before I learn what my father believed." Miriam moved toward Venn, leaving them beside the darkened window. Clara faced Jonah fully. "No more pieces, no more deciding which facts I can endure." Jonah removed his revolver and placed it on the table between them, not as surrender, but as a way of separating the story from the weapon he had become. "Your father left Red Mesa with 4 deputies, a driver, and me," he began. "We carried the survey map, account copies, and enough testimony to force a federal inquiry. Elias divided the evidence because he expected an attempt to steal it. We entered Bitter Creek shortly after sunrise. The first shot killed the driver. The second struck Deputy Harlan, not Wade Harlan, another man, and brought the lead wagon across the trail." Jonah's voice remained controlled, but Clara saw tension spread through his hands. Gunmen held both canyon walls. Boone commanded the men on the northern ridge. Vale was not there, but everyone knew whose money paid them. The escort tried to reach a stone cut near the assay office. One deputy died while covering the wagon. Another was wounded and dragged behind a boulder with Elias. Boone called down that the shooting would stop if they surrendered the evidence. Jonah argued against it, but Elias believed the wounded deputy would die unless someone acted. He stepped into the open, Jonah said. He placed his pistol on the ground and raised both hands. He told Boone the records had already been copied and that killing him would prove Vale's guilt. Clara gripped the edge of the table. What did Boone do? Jonah looked directly at her. He shot your father through the chest after he surrendered. The clinic seemed to lose all sound except the slow drip of water into Miriam's basin. Jonah had fired before Elias struck the ground. He killed the man beside Boone, then another gunman descending the southern slope. The canyon became smoke, stone splinters, and ricocheting lead. Elias was still alive when Jonah reached him. He pressed the torn map into Jonah's hand and ordered him to ride east, drawing the remaining attackers away from the evidence. He said you would know what the numbers meant, Jonah told Clara. He said you had watched him work since you were a child. Jonah mounted a loose horse and fought his way through the eastern cut. 3 gunmen followed him. By the time he circled back after dark, the wagon had burned, the deputies were dead, and Elias's body had been moved. Vale's men later claimed the entire party had killed one another during a dispute over stolen silver. You left him there, Clara said. The words trembled despite her effort to control them. I followed his order. That does not change what happened. No, Jonah did not defend himself. I believed drawing Boone away would give Elias time. I was wrong, he explained. That he returned to Red Mesa weeks later under another name. Vale's men were watching Clara's home, the telegraph office, and everyone who had spoken to Elias. Jonah planned to take the map to Santa Fe himself. But before he could leave, riders attacked the ranch where his wife Rebecca and their 8-year-old son Samuel lived. Both were killed. The house burned. The gunman carved a message into the barn door, demanding the missing survey evidence. Clara's anger weakened beneath a grief she had not expected to share. Jonah continued because stopping would have required beginning again. He hunted the men responsible. 3 died in gunfights across Arizona and Colorado. The 4th surrendered beside a frozen river after admitting he had helped burn the Rourke Ranch. Jonah pressed a revolver against the man's head and nearly executed him. I wanted him afraid, Jonah said. Not judged, not arrested afraid. He lowered the weapon only when he saw his own reflection in the ice. The man later died in prison, but Jonah resigned his badge the same day. That was when I understood Vale had taken more than my family. He had turned me into the story he wanted people to believe. Clara crossed the room and struck him across the face. The sound startled Miriam, but Jonah did not move. You knew what his men did, Clara said. You knew my father had not died in a wagon accident. You carried his map for 12 years, and you let me live beside the man who murdered him. Yes, do not answer as though confession makes it honorable. It does not. You decided silence would protect me, just as Miriam did, just as Amos did. Every person in this town has hidden cowardice behind concern. Jonah accepted each word. That made her angrier. Say something. You are right. His voice was quiet. I believed telling you would bring Vale's men back. I also believed I had no right to stand before you after failing Elias. Both beliefs served my fear. Clara returned to the letter and opened the final fold. Elias had written that if Jonah survived Bitter Creek, he must not be blamed for the ambush. He described Jonah as a disciplined officer who had repeatedly placed himself between danger and the other members of the party. The final sentence read, "Trust him with what remains, Clara. He will believe himself unworthy of it, which is why he may be the one man who will not sell it." Clara read the words twice. They did not erase Jonah's silence, nor did they remove the 12 years stolen from her, but they changed the shape of her anger. My father trusted you, she said. I did not deserve it. That is not your decision either. Jonah looked at her then, and something unguarded passed between them. I should have come back. Yes, I cannot change that. No, but you can stop hiding now. They planned to leave for Bitter Creek before sunset. The assay office stood within a collapsed mining settlement 2 days west by the direct trail. Though Jonah knew a shorter canyon route, Miriam insisted Ven could not travel. The recorder had regained consciousness briefly, but remembered little beyond Boone entering the archive. Clara left the deed index with Miriam, reasoning that separating the evidence would prevent Vale from destroying everything at once. Before they could saddle the horses, smoke rose beyond the mission wall. A child screamed from the courtyard. Jonah reached the door as flames burst through the barn roof. Men fired from the cottonwood grove, driving the mission residents away from the road. Boone had found them. Miriam ran toward the barn before anyone could stop her. 2 children were trapped behind a fallen feed rack, their cries nearly lost beneath the roar of the fire. Clara followed, covering her face with her sleeve. Jonah fired toward the grove, forcing the attackers behind trees, then entered the barn through the side door. Heat rolled across the floor. Miriam pulled one child free, while Clara lifted the other from beneath a broken board. A burning beam fell between them. Jonah crossed through the sparks, caught Miriam around the waist, and dragged her clear seconds before part of the roof collapsed. Outside, Miriam tried to stand but cried out. A falling board had cut her temple and injured her ankle. Clara knelt beside her as horses thundered into the mission yard. Sheriff Amos Bell rode at the head of 6 deputies, holding 2 folded warrants. Boone's men withdrew into the grove, but did not leave. Clara Whitmore and Jonah Rourke, Amos called. You are under arrest for burglary, assault, attempted murder, and the killing of Horace Venn. Clara rose. Venn is alive. Amos's eyes flicked toward the mission's infirmary. Vale says otherwise. Then enter and see him. I cannot. Jonah stepped into the yard with his revolver drawn but pointed down. Cannot or will not. Amos lowered his voice. Boone has men around the mission. Vale ordered them to kill everyone inside if you resist. He will call it a fire caused by fugitives. Jonah studied the windows, counting children, sisters, and injured residents. We can hold the walls. Not without bodies, Clara said. Jonah turned to her. If we surrender, Vale controls what happens next. If we fight, he kills people who never chose this. He may kill them anyway. Then we force him to do it before witnesses wearing his sheriff's badge. Amos flinched. Clara held Jonah's gaze. She understood what surrender cost him. Bitter Creek had begun with Elias trusting an enemy's promise. This is my decision, she said. I will not let another mission burn for evidence bearing my family's name. Jonah looked toward Boone's shadow among the trees. Every instinct in him demanded violence. Instead, he holstered his revolver and handed it to Amos. If one person here is harmed, he said, your debt to Vale will be the least of what follows. Amos took the weapon with shaking hands. Vale arranged the hearing before Clara's clothing had stopped smelling of smoke. The courthouse filled with townspeople, summoned by the same bell used for her punishment. Clara stood before the council with her wrists bound. Jonah, chained at the ankles and hands, remained beneath the guard of 4 deputies. Vale displayed bloodied papers recovered from the archive and announced that Recorder Vannon had died from wounds received during the burglary. Miriam, confined at the mission under guard, could not contradict him. Clara Whitmore led an armed criminal into the courthouse, Vale said. When the lawful recorder resisted, they murdered him and stole public documents. Clara saw uncertainty among the crowd, but fear kept it silent. Produce his body, she demanded. His family requested privacy. He has no family in Red Mesa. Vale approached with a prepared transfer contract. There is still a path to mercy. Sign over every Whitmore claim connected to Mercy Spring. Admit that Elias Whitmore falsified the survey and that your accusations arose from grief. In return, the council will reduce your sentence and spare Rourke from immediate execution. Jonah's chains shifted behind her. Clara read the document. It surrendered not only her father's claims, but every legal objection tied to the Drywells ranches. "You beat me because I would not give you the ledger," she said. "You burned High Mesa because you could not find it. Now you invent a murder because the railroad delegation arrives tomorrow." For the first time, Vale's calm slipped. Sign. Clara tore the top corner from the contract with her bound hands. No. The hearing ended immediately. Jonah was taken through the courthouse basement toward an abandoned silver mine connected to Vale's property by old freight tunnels. Clara was locked inside the records room, its windows barred and its shelves stripped of anything useful. Amos remained after the deputies left. He removed his hat, but could not meet her eyes. "I am sorry." Clara sat against the wall. "You said the same thing while they tied me to the rail. My wife's medicine, my home Vale, owns all of it. Then he also owns every excuse you make." Amos swallowed. "I tried to keep people alive. No, you kept them obedient." He reached toward the door. "I will do what I can." Clara looked at the badge on his chest. "You have been doing what you can for years." Vale entered after midnight, carrying her father's red ledger. Clara's heart stopped until she noticed a faint cut along the lower spine. It was the copy she had prepared months earlier, filled with selected entries and several deliberate errors. The original remained sewn inside the inner lining of her dress, pressed against her ribs beneath the torn fabric. Vale placed the book on a metal tray. "Before sunrise, you will sign the transfer. The railroad delegation arrives tomorrow afternoon, and I will not allow a dead surveyor's daughter to interfere with Red Mesa's future." Clara glanced at the ledger. "You still cannot read it. I do not need to." He struck a match and touched it to the pages. The paper curled black beneath the flame. Clara forced herself not to react. Boone entered while the false ledger burned. "Ven is awake," he said. Vale's gaze hardened. Boone smiled at Clara. "Not for long. We moved him into the mine with Rourke." Vale had wanted Clara to believe Ven dead, but Boone enjoyed cruelty more than discipline. "You should have killed the recorder at the courthouse," Vale said. "I thought Wade finished him. Thinking has never been your strength." Boone's scarred hand tightened, and Clara saw resentment flicker between the two men. Vale turned back to her. "At dawn, you sign. If you refuse, Rourke and Ven will be executed while attempting escape." After they left, Clara waited until the footsteps faded. She tore open 3 stitches inside her dress and touched the leather cover of the true ledger. It remained safe. Smoke from the copy drifted beneath the door, carrying the bitter smell of scorched paper. She closed her eyes and listened to the building settle. Somewhere below, metal struck metal in an uneven rhythm. 3 short taps. A pause. 2 long taps. Clara opened her eyes. The sound traveled through an old heating pipe running along the wall. It was not random. It was telegraph code. She pulled a metal hairpin free and answered against the pipe. 1 tap to confirm she could hear. The reply came slowly, each word broken by distance and stone. "Mine tunnel beneath courthouse." Clara pressed closer. Another sequence followed. "Ven alive." Then a longer pause. She feared the connection had ended until the pipe sounded again. Dawn, execution. Clara closed her fingers around the hairpin. Vale believed she was locked in a room with no weapon, no ally, and no evidence. Beneath the courthouse, Jonah was chained inside the mine with the only living witness to the forged deeds. She opened the hidden ledger across her knees and tapped her reply into the darkness. "Hold on." Clara kept the hairpin against the heating pipe until her fingers went numb. Jonah's replies arrived slowly, weakened by distance and whatever chains Vale had used below. 2 chambers, he tapped, Ven East. Guard changes at bell. Clara listened for footsteps in the corridor before answering. "I have ledger. Finding way down." A pause followed. Then Jonah sent a single command. "Wait." Clara nearly laughed. Even chained beneath a courthouse, he still believed protection began, with telling her to remain still. She struck the pipe firmly. No. The answer took longer this time. Then 3 short taps came through an acknowledgement rather than agreement. Clara folded the true ledger beneath her torn dress and studied the locked room. The heating pipe entered the floor beside an unused iron stove. If the courthouse had once been connected to mine offices, there had to be a service passage nearby. Vale had imprisoned her inside a records room. Records, she had learned, revealed more than the men who kept them intended. The door opened shortly before dawn. Vale entered carrying a fresh transfer document, an ink bottle, and a steel-nibbed pen. Boone followed with Curtis Voss and Roy Denner. Clara sat against the wall, making herself appear exhausted. Vale placed the contract on an empty desk. You have had the night to consider how many lives your pride will cost. You burned the ledger, she said softly. He mistook restraint for defeat and removed the last reason for this performance. Boone leaned against the doorframe, smiling. Vale untied Clara's right wrist and pushed the pen toward her. Sign every page. Admit Elias Whitmore falsified the survey. Transfer all remaining Whitmore claims to the Red Mesa Water and Cattle Company. Do that, and Rourke may live long enough to face a lawful trial. Clara lowered her eyes to the document. And then, the recorder's fate depends upon his usefulness. The legal description covered 3 pages, listing the boundaries of Mercy Spring, the Dry Wells Ranch District, and the Stone Aqueduct. Clara read slowly, pretending confusion while Vale grew impatient. Near the second page's lower margin, the northern boundary was marked by a standard survey symbol, a triangle beside the original claim number. With the pen angled beneath her palm, Clara changed one short line, converting the territorial boundary mark into the symbol for an unverified mineral stake. Any competent land examiner would reject the transfer. On the final page, she signed her name with unusual spaces between several letters. To Vale, the uneven writing would appear to be the weakness of an injured hand. To a trained operator, the gaps formed telegraph code, coerced, false deed. Vale holds witnesses. She finished with a trembling flourish and allowed the pen to fall. Vale examined the signature, but not the spacing. His attention rested on the surrender of property, not the language that might destroy it. At last, he said, Clara let her shoulders sag. You have what you wanted. I have what was always mine. He folded the pages and placed them inside his coat. Boone watched him with open resentment. What about Rourke? Vale adjusted his cuffs. Keep him alive until the railroad delegation arrives. A notorious gunman attempting escape will provide an excellent demonstration of why Red Mesa requires stronger private security. Boone's burn-scarred hand tightened. Clara understood the threat beneath the order. Vale planned to use Jonah's death to increase his power and Boone's guilt to conceal it. The delegation reaches the square by noon, Vale continued. I expect both prisoners moved before then. He left with Boone and Curtis, taking the forged transfer with him. Roy remained outside the door. An hour later, Amos Bell entered alone. He carried a lantern and a ring of iron keys. His eyes looked older than they had the day before. Vale wants you moved to the bank basement. Clara remained seated. Does your wife know what you permitted in the square? Amos stopped. Leave her out of this. You brought her into it each time you used her illness as an excuse. His face hardened, though the anger did not last. Vale paid for treatments I could not afford. When she recovered, he held the debt. Then came the house, my daughter's dowry, and every mistake I made while trying to cover the first. So you gave him arrests, warrants, and 5 men with whips. I told myself refusing would put someone worse behind the badge. Clara looked at him. Someone worse would at least have spared you the lie that you remained honorable. Amos sat on the edge of the desk. You think courage is simple because you have already lost almost everything. No, I think fear grows each time a person obeys it. Clara lowered her voice. Vale will discard you when the railroad men arrive. He has forged records bearing your initials. When this breaks, he will say, the sheriff acted alone. Amos's gaze shifted toward the door. What do you want from me? The truth. Truth will not protect my family. Neither will Vale. For several seconds, only the lantern flame moved. Amos rose, crossed to the stove, and looked at the heating pipe. Then he placed the key ring on the desk, as if distracted, while checking Clara's wrist rope. Roy changes guard when the courthouse bell rings, he said. The old service stair is behind the third shelving cabinet. He retied the rope loosely and walked out without taking the keys. Clara waited until Roy's boots faded along the corridor. When the bell rang once above the courthouse, she slipped her wrist free and seized the keys. The third cabinet resisted until she wedged the desk leg beneath its frame. Behind it lay a narrow wooden door covered by years of dust. One key opened the rusted lock. A steep stair descended into blackness. Clara took Amos's lantern, the ledger, and a coil of rope from the record shelves. The air below smelled of iron, damp earth, and coal smoke. Old freight symbols had been painted at each junction, marking routes once used to move ore beneath the courthouse and Vale's bank. Clara followed the heating pipe east. At the first intersection, she tapped it with the hairpin. Jonah answered from somewhere ahead. She found him inside a timbered chamber, one wrist chained to an iron ring set into the wall. His coat had been taken, and dried blood marked one side of his face. Relief crossed his eyes before irritation replaced it. You should have waited. Clara held up the keys. Then you would still be chained. Boone has guards nearby. Not for long. The third key opened the shackle. Jonah rose stiffly and tested his shoulder. Did Vale get the ledger, a copy, and the transfer? I signed it. He stared at her. You did what? I altered the boundary mark and placed a coded confession inside my signature. Try to look less disappointed. A sound almost resembling laughter escaped him. I am beginning to understand why Elias trusted you. Clara handed him a discarded pick handle. Understand while walking. Ven is east. The recorder lay inside a second chamber behind a barred gate. His wounded shoulder had bled through Miriam's bandage, and fever made his eyes unfocused. Jonah broke the weakened lock with the pick handle, while Clara supported Ven's weight. Can you walk? She asked. Not far. Far enough will have to do. Footsteps echoed from the western tunnel. Boone's voice followed. Rourke! Vale says you are worth more dead. But I have waited 12 years to see whether the stories were true. Jonah took Ven's other arm. They moved through the eastern passage as Boone and two men entered the chamber behind them. A bullet struck the wall near Clara's head. Jonah returned, one shot from a revolver, taken off an unconscious guard, forcing the pursuers back. The tunnel divided around a collapsed ore cart. Clara raised the lantern and examined the faded freight marks painted on the beams. A circle crossed by two diagonal lines identified the old assay route. She had seen the symbol in shipping accounts from the abandoned mine. This way, she said, pointing toward the narrower passage. Jonah glanced at the low roof. Are you certain? No. But the other route returns to Vale's bank. They carried Ven through a corridor that descended sharply beneath the ridge. Boone followed, shouting that Jonah had abandoned Elias at Bitter Creek. When they reached a wider chamber, Boone appeared on a ledge above them. Tell her the rest, he called. Tell her who fired first. Tell her how her father begged. Jonah lowered Ven and started toward the ledge. Clara caught his arm. He wants you away from us. Boone laughed. Elias put down his gun. Thought surrender made him safe. I shot him before his knees touched the dirt. Jonah's face changed. The discipline Clara had trusted disappeared beneath 12 years of grief. He raised the revolver and stepped toward the passage Boone had taken Jonah. He did not answer. Ven cannot move without us. Boone murdered your father, and he wants you to murder him while Vale's only living witness dies in this tunnel. Jonah's hand tightened around the gun. Clara stood between him and the ledge. Choose revenge or the man who can help prove what happened. For one terrible moment, she feared Jonah would move past her. Then he lowered the revolver and returned to Ven. We take the witness. The assay chamber lay beyond a warped iron door marked with the territorial mining seal. Inside stood rotted tables, broken scales, and rows of cabinets green with corrosion. Clara searched by lantern light while Jonah barred the door behind them. Elias's letter had mentioned a copper duplicate stored where official lines could not be altered. She opened drawer after drawer until she found an equipment cabinet secured by a brass survey lock. Her father's compass fit the circular depression beneath the keyhole. When she pressed its lid against the mechanism, the catch released. Inside lay a flat object wrapped in cracked oilskin. Clara unfolded it carefully. The copper plate beneath bore the engraved boundaries of Mercy Spring. The original claim number 18 read 7, and the seal of the New Mexico Territorial Survey Office. A folded note rested beneath the plate. Clara recognized Elias's handwriting immediately. The plate proves the land. The ledger proves the crime. Neither will stand alone. Trust the numbers and trust the bearer of the torn map. Clara pressed the note to her lips before placing it inside the ledger. Then examined the copper plate with his good hand. Vale ordered me to replace this number in every county index. He said the original plate had been destroyed. Will you testify? Clara asked, then looked toward the barred door as Boone's men struck it from outside. If I live. Jonah checked the chamber walls. A narrow ventilation shaft rose behind the assay furnace. You and Ven can fit through there. Clara saw the black powder wire running from an abandoned blasting box toward the lower supports. And you, I hold the door. The iron latch broke. Boone entered with Curtis and Lem Pike as Clara guided Ven into the shaft. Jonah fired low, striking the floor and forcing the men apart. Boone answered with his rifle. The bullet tore through Jonah's sleeve, but missed flesh. Clara helped Ven climb, then returned to the blasting box. The wires were old, but enough copper remained to carry a spark. Clara, go! Jonah shouted. She wrapped the bare ends around the lantern's ignition contact. Curtis rushed the furnace. Jonah struck him with the revolver's grip and shoved him behind a table. Boone fired again, splintering the cabinet that had hidden the plate. Clara waited until Jonah crossed the painted safety line her father's notes had marked on the wall. Then she touched the wires together. The charge beneath the lower support did not explode so much as groan through the earth. Stone cracked overhead. Jonah dove toward the shaft as part of the chamber collapsed between them and Boone's men. Dust swallowed the lantern light. Boone's curses continued from the other side, proving the rockfall had blocked rather than buried him. Jonah climbed after Clara and Ven through the narrow shaft. They emerged onto a ledge above Bitter Creek as thunder rolled over the western mountains. Rain struck the canyon in heavy drops, turning dust to dark mud within minutes. Behind them, another section of the assay roof fell. Clara held the copper plate beneath her cloak, while Jonah supported Ven down the slope. They found 3 horses tied near Boone's eastern camp. Ven nearly collapsed while mounting, but Jonah secured him in the saddle. Lightning revealed sheets of water rushing through the lower canyon. The north road will be gone, Jonah said. So will the telegraph line. Ven's teeth chattered. The railroad delegation travels with Territorial Judge Nathaniel Cross. Vale requested him to approve the land transfers. Clara looked toward Red Mesa. Then we put the plate, ledger, and your testimony in front of him before Vale completes the sale. Amos must produce his records, Ven said. Vale's payments to the sheriff prove the seizures were planned. Jonah mounted behind Ven long enough to steady him. Amos may not stand. He left me the keys, Clara said. He has begun. The storm turned the return journey into a struggle against water and darkness. Twice they left the main trail to avoid flooded cuts. By morning, they reached a canyon crossing where the creek had widened into a violent brown river. The wooden bridge was gone. Jonah found a shallower section upstream, though water already reached the horses' bellies. Clara crossed first with the ledger tied beneath her coat and the copper plate secured inside the saddlebag. Ven followed on a rope held by Jonah. Halfway through, rifle fire came from the ridge behind them. Boone had escaped the blocked assay chamber. His first shot missed. The second struck Jonah below the shoulder and spun him from the saddle. Clara turned her horse back. Jonah surfaced beside a boulder, gripping the reins with one hand while blood spread through his shirt. She reached him as another bullet struck the water. Get on, Ven is across. So are you in another minute. Together they reached the far bank, where Jonah fell to one knee. Boone and two riders descended toward the crossing. Jonah removed the copper plate from Clara's saddlebag and pressed it back into her hands. Ride to Red Mesa. Not without you. The judge reaches the square by noon. Then we all go. I cannot keep pace. Clara tore cloth from her sleeve and pressed it against the wound. You stayed when I asked you to. That was different because you were the one choosing. Jonah caught her wrist. If Boone takes the plate, Elias dies a liar again. If Vale completes the transfer, every Drywell's family loses its land. This evidence matters more than whether I reach the town. Clara's eyes burned with anger and fear. Do not ask me to abandon another man at Bitter Creek. You are not abandoning me. You are finishing what your father began. Ven called weakly from his horse that riders were entering the water. Jonah gave Clara his revolver and took the rifle from Ven's saddle. I can delay them from the rocks. You know, the Eastern Freight Trail. It reaches Red Mesa before the main road. Clara understood the calculation. She hated him for making it correctly. She pressed her forehead briefly against his. It was the closest they had come without injury or necessity between them. Do not make this your punishment, she whispered. Jonah's expression softened. For the first time in 12 years, it is not. He helped her mount, then turned toward the ridge with the rifle. Clara took Ven's reins and rode east as gunfire began behind them. She did not look back until they reached the high trail. Jonah stood among the rocks below, alone against 3 riders advancing through the flood. Smoke covered him after the next volley. Clara could no longer tell whether he remained standing. Near noon, she reached the ridge overlooking Red Mesa. The storm had passed over the town, leaving the streets wet and shining beneath a hard white sky. Wagons circled the square, flags hung from Vale's bank, and a polished stagecoach stood beside the courthouse. The railroad delegation had arrived. Gideon Vale was already addressing the crowd from the same steps where he had ordered Clara punished. Behind her, distant riders emerged from the canyon trail. Boone had survived, and Jonah was nowhere in sight. Clara tightened her grip on the reins. The ledger rested against her heart. The copper plate lay beneath her coat. Recorder Ven swayed in the saddle beside her. Then Clara Whitmore rode down toward the town that had watched her bleed. Gideon Vale stood beneath a blue and white railroad banner as Clara descended the ridge into Red Mesa. Rainwater still ran along the street gutters, but the square was crowded with ranchers, merchants, railroad officials, and families ordered to attend what Vale had called the beginning of a prosperous new age. A polished stagecoach waited before the courthouse. Beside it stood a severe man in a black coat, whom Clara recognized from territorial newspapers as Judge Nathaniel Cross. Vale's voice carried across the square. With these agreements, the Red Mesa corridor will be cleared for construction, creating employment and security for every responsible citizen. Then someone near the Western Road shouted Clara's name. Heads turned. The crowd opened uneasily as she rode toward the courthouse with Horace Ven swaying in the saddle behind her. Mud stained her dress. Blood darkened Ven's bandage. Beneath Clara's coat, the copper survey plate pressed against her ribs. Vale stopped speaking. His face betrayed surprise for only an instant. "Sheriff Bell," he said, "arrest that woman." Amos stood beside the courthouse steps with 2 deputies. He had shaved and changed his coat for the ceremony, but exhaustion hollowed his eyes. His hand moved toward his revolver, then stopped. Clara dismounted and helped Ven slide from the horse. Several townspeople gasped. Vale had told them the recorder was dead. "Horace Ven lives," Clara called. "So does the evidence Gideon Vale tried to bury with him." Judge Cross stepped away from the railroad representatives. "What evidence?" Vale descended 1 step. "Your Honor, this woman is a fugitive accused of burglary, attempted murder, and conspiracy with a notorious gunman." Clara faced the judge. "Then hear the accusation after you examine what he is trying to purchase with stolen land." Vale signaled Amos again. "Do your duty." Amos did not move. Clara removed the copper plate from beneath her coat and held it where the territorial seal caught the sunlight. Judge Cross's expression changed. Bring that forward. Vale stepped between them. A manufactured object proves nothing. Then you should have no objection to its examination, Clara said. She placed the plate on the courthouse table beside Vale's railroad contracts. The judge bent over the engraved lines. The seal appears authentic. One of the railroad surveyors approached, removed a magnifying lens, and inspected the edge. The plate bears the old Santa Fe survey office mark. They stopped using this stamp in '76. Vale's jaw tightened. Old equipment can be stolen. Clara took out Elias's ledger. That is why the plate does not stand alone. Judge Cross ordered the ceremony suspended. Vale protested that the railroad representatives had traveled hundreds of miles, and that Red Mesa could not be held hostage by a criminal spectacle. The judge ignored him and asked Venn whether he could testify. The recorder leaned against the table, barely able to stand. I altered the county deed books, he said. A shock passed through the square. Mr. Vale ordered the changes. Claim 18 Red 7 became 18 Red 17. Once the number changed, the public spring and surrounding ranch boundaries appeared to belong to the Red Mesa Water and Cattle Company. Vale smiled without warmth. Mr. Venn accepted bribes for years. His admission proves only that he is corrupt. Venn lowered his head. Clara answered, before shame could silence him. He is corrupt. Guilt does not make his records false. It makes his willingness to confess dangerous to the man who paid him. Miriam Hale appeared at the edge of the crowd on crutches, accompanied by two sisters from St. Jude's Mission. She carried the donation register and Elias's sealed letter beneath one arm. Several ranch women moved beside her, including Hannah Mercer and Tom Rusk's wife, Elizabeth. Vale's guards tried to block them, but Judge Cross ordered a path cleared. Miriam placed the mission record beside the copper plate. The De Herrera family donated Mercy Spring for public use in 1859. The original claim number matches the plate. She then handed Elias's letter to the judge. Elias Whitmore left this with me before his final journey. Vale's composure began to fracture. A private letter written by a disgraced surveyor. Clara opened the ledger. Then let us use your own accounts. She turned to the entries she had decoded at High Mesa. Each line appeared to describe freight, lamp oil, axle assemblies, harness leather, mining tools. Clara explained that the quantities were not quantities at all. They corresponded to dates, claim numbers, and payments. 32 crates of oil matched the transfer of the Mercer Ranch. 12 axle assemblies matched the day. Vale acquired the Northern Aqueduct Gate. Initials marked the recipients: HV for Horace Venn, AB for Amos Bell, BL for Boone Lasker, and GV for the man who authorized the payments. Vale lifted his chin. GV could refer to anyone. Perhaps, Clara said. So let us discuss the survey instead. She tapped the copper plate. Why does the authentic record use claim 18 Red 7 when your company deed uses 18 Red 17? Vale answered too quickly. Because Elias changed the number after the Bitter Creek inspection. Silence settled over the square. Even the railroad representatives seemed to understand before Vale did. Clara watched realization move across his face. The Bitter Creek inspection was never entered into county records, she said. My father's final route was kept secret. Horace did not know where the plate was hidden. I did not know until last night, yet you know when the number was changed. Vale looked toward Judge Cross. Everyone in business heard rumors. Then name one person who heard that exact detail. He said nothing. Clara continued. You knew because your men followed my father into Bitter Creek. You knew because you ordered the evidence taken before he reached Santa Fe. A horse screamed at the southern entrance to the square. Boone Lasker rode through with Wade Curtis, Lem, and 3 additional gunmen behind him. Mud coated their clothing, and rage distorted Boone's broken features. Get away from that table, he shouted. Vale's relief showed plainly. Sheriff, remove these fugitives and restore order. Boone dismounted with his rifle raised. I said, move. Miriam stepped in front of Clara. Hannah Mercer joined her. Then Elizabeth Rusk and 4 women from Dry Wells formed a line around the evidence. Tom Rusk drove his wagon across the eastern exit. Another rancher blocked the western road. One by one, men who had lowered their eyes during Clara's punishment moved their horses and wagons into the remaining gaps. Boone looked around as if the town had changed shape while he was away. Vale turned on Amos. Clear the square. The sheriff's face had gone pale. No. Vale stared at him. Your home, your wife's treatments, your daughter's future, all of it exists because of me. Amos removed his badge. That is what I told myself every time I signed one of your orders. He placed the badge on the courthouse table. From inside his coat, he produced a packet tied with black cord. Copies of property seizures, arrest instructions, and payments issued through Vale Bank. I kept them because I knew one day he would blame everything on me. Vale's eyes became almost colorless. Amos faced the crowd. I allowed an unlawful punishment. I arrested innocent people. I used this badge to protect a man who owned my debt. Nothing, I say, removes that guilt. He held the packet toward Judge Cross. But these records prove who gave the orders. Vale drew a small pistol from beneath his coat and fired. Amos fell against the courthouse steps, the packet scattering across the wet boards. For half a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Boone raised his rifle and the square erupted. Jonah's first shot came from the western rooftop. It struck the barrel of Wade's revolver and sent the weapon spinning. Jonah dropped from the awning to the street, landing hard on one knee. Blood had soaked through the bandage beneath his coat, and his face was gray from the ride, but he remained upright. "Down!" he shouted. The townspeople pulled children behind wagons. Miriam dragged Amos toward cover, while Clara gathered the scattered records. Judge Cross and the railroad surveyors crouched behind the stone base of the town bell. Curtis charged the evidence table. Jonah intercepted him, caught his gun arm, and drove him into a hitching post. Lem fired from beside the saloon, but Tom Rusk struck him with a shovel before he could shoot again. Roy, Danner remained mounted, at the edge of the square, frozen between Boone's orders and the townspeople surrounding him. "Right away," Jonah told him. Roy looked at Boone, then threw his pistol into the mud and fled. Boone moved toward the center of the street, with his rifle leveled. "Bitter Creek should have killed you." Jonah faced him across 20 yards of rain-darkened dust. "It killed enough. Draw proper. Let them see what you are. They already have." Boone wanted a duel that would turn the square into a legend and every witness into an afterthought. Jonah refused to give it to him. He remained beside Judge Cross and the evidence, forcing Boone to fire toward the people he claimed to protect. Boone's first bullet struck the courthouse railing. The second shattered the town bell rope. Jonah fired once. Boone's rifle dropped as blood spread across his gun hand. He reached for the revolver at his hip with the other hand. Jonah crossed the distance before he could draw, struck him across the wrist, and forced him face first into the mud. Boone expected the final shot. Jonah pressed the revolver against the back of his neck, breathing hard enough to shake. Elias's death, Rebecca's burning home, and Samuel's empty bed seemed to stand around him. "Do it," Boone said. "Prove every story." Jonah looked toward Clara. She held the copper plate against her chest while protecting the wounded Amos. Her eyes did not command mercy. They trusted him to choose it. Jonah removed the revolver from Boone's neck. "You will testify." Boone laughed bitterly. "Vale will hang me before sunset. Not if the territorial judge hears you first." 2 ranchers bound Boone's hands. Jonah tried to straighten, but the wound beneath his shoulder opened again. Clara started toward him. Before she reached the center of the square, Vale seized the ledger and copper plate from the table. He ran through the open doors of his bank. "Guard the witnesses," Clara told Jonah. She followed Vale inside. Smoke already rose from the rear archive. He had overturned an oil lamp across the shelves, setting mortgage files and account books aflame. Clara pulled Elias's ledger beneath her coat before the fire could reach it, but Vale struck her shoulder with the silver head of his cane. She fell against a cabinet. He seized the copper plate and dragged her through a rear passage leading toward the stone aqueduct. "You have no idea what I built," he said. "This town was mud and starving cattle before I gave it order." Clara struggled to keep her feet. "You sold them water that already belonged to them. I made it valuable." They emerged onto the maintenance platform above the main channel. Below, rainwater and spring runoff churned behind the reservoir gates. Vale pressed the pistol beneath Clara's jaw and held the copper plate over the current. The wooden platform creaked under their weight. Years of neglected repairs had left one support split near the center. From the square came distant shouting as Jonah followed through the bank. Vale pulled Clara closer. "One shot and she falls," he called when Jonah appeared at the aqueduct entrance. Jonah stopped. His revolver remained low. "Let her go. Throw down the gun." Jonah placed it on the stones. "Now the evidence," Vale said. "The ledger first." Clara looked toward the emergency release lever beside the platform. It controlled the gate below them, but reaching it would require turning into Vale's weapon. She kept him talking. "My father knew you would murder him. Your father believed papers could defeat power. That is why you followed him to Bitter Creek." Vale's grip tightened. "He could have accepted my offer. I would have made him wealthy." Jonah remained motionless near the entrance. Clara continued. "Instead, you paid Boone to kill him. I paid Boone to recover stolen company property. The survey belonged to the territory. The survey threatened the railroad route. Elias forced my hand." The words carried beyond the aqueduct wall. Townspeople had gathered at the entrance behind Jonah, including Judge Cross and 2 railroad representatives. Vale did not see them. Anger had reduced his world to Clara. "You murdered him to protect a land purchase," she said. "I removed one man to protect an entire town. Then you murdered Jonah's family. Those fools were supposed to recover the map." Jonah's face became still. Vale smiled at the pain he had caused. "You see, Rourke, everyone near you dies. That woman will be no different." Clara shifted her weight toward the broken support. "You are wrong about one thing." Vale pulled the pistol tighter. "Only one? Red Mesa existed before you. It will exist after you." She drove her elbow into his ribs and seized the emergency lever. Vale fired, but the shot went wide as she pulled with both hands. The gate below released. Water thundered into the channel, shaking the platform. The split support snapped. Vale lost his footing. The pistol flew from his hand, and the copper plate struck the railing before falling onto the stone ledge. Clara slid toward the open channel. Jonah crossed the platform as it collapsed, caught her wrist, and pulled her against the remaining support. Vale fell through the broken boards, but became pinned beneath a timber above the rushing water. He screamed for Jonah to help him. Jonah secured Clara on the ledge, then climbed down far enough to keep Vale's head above the current. "Do not let me drown, Vale," gasped. "I own this town." Clara retrieved the copper plate. "Not anymore." Judge Cross ordered the reservoir gate partially closed and directed the ranchers to lift the broken timber. Vale was pulled from the channel alive, coughing water and cursing every person who touched him. Boone watched from the square as deputies tied Vale's hands. "He planned to blame Bitter Creek on me," Boone said. "He promised me the North Ranch." Vale turned on him. "Keep your mouth shut." Boone's expression changed as he understood that they would sacrifice him without hesitation. "Federal protection," he called to Judge Cross. "I testify about Elias Whitmore, the ambush, all of it." Judge Cross ordered Vale, Boone, Wade, Curtis, Lem, and the remaining gunmen held under territorial authority. He placed the evidence in the custody of the railroad surveyors and appointed 2 ranchers to guard the courthouse records. Amos remained alive, though Miriam warned that the bullet had lodged near his ribs. Water from Mercy Spring continued through the newly opened channel, spilling into the public trough for the first time in years. Children approached it cautiously, as if expecting someone to demand payment. Then Hannah Mercer filled both hands and gave the water to her daughter. Clara found Jonah beside the old hitching rail. The broken whip handle from the first day had been placed there as evidence. He looked at the water running beneath it and tried to speak. His knees failed before the words came. Clara caught him as he collapsed, lowering him into the wet dust. Miriam hurried from Amos's side and pressed her hand against Jonah's reopened wound. He has lost too much blood. Clara held his face between her hands. His eyes opened briefly. Did the judge take the plate? He whispered. Yes. The ledger? Safe. Relief passed over him. Then Elias made it. His eyes closed again. Around them, Red Mesa stood in the same square where Clara had once been tied before a silent crowd. This time no one turned away. Men brought blankets. Women cleared a path to the clinic. Ranchers lifted Jonah carefully while Miriam directed them. Above the courthouse, the wind moved the bell whose rope had been shot apart. It gave one low, accidental note. Vale's power had ended. Clara did not yet know whether Jonah would live to see what came after it. Jonah woke to the sound of water moving through a pipe beneath Miriam Hale's clinic. For several confused seconds, he believed he was back at Bitter Creek, listening to floodwater strike the canyon stones while men shouted above him. Then the scent of boiled linen and carbolic replaced gun smoke, and he saw Clara asleep in a chair beside the bed. Her head rested against the wall, one hand still curled around a stack of legal papers. Morning light crossed her face and caught the pale scar near her temple left by flying glass. Jonah tried to move. Pain spread from his shoulder through his ribs, and the bed frame creaked. Clara opened her eyes immediately. Do not attempt anything heroic, she said. Miriam has threatened to sew you to the mattress. Jonah looked toward the window. How long? 4 days. He closed his eyes. Vale, alive, under federal guard. Furious about both, Clara helped him drink water while explaining what had happened after he collapsed. Judge Cross had assumed temporary authority over Red Mesa's courthouse and bank records. Vale's hired men were confined in separate cells to keep them from agreeing upon a shared story. Boone Lasker had begun talking before sunset, offering names, dates, and locations in exchange for protection. Amos Bell had survived surgery, though Miriam said the bullet had passed close enough to his lung that he would never again breathe easily during hard exertion. And Ven? Jonah asked. Recovering. He has confessed to altering the deeds. Clara placed the cup down. Neither Amos nor Horace will escape punishment. Jonah studied her expression. You sound as though someone expects you to ask for mercy. Several people have, I told them. Mercy and exemption are not the same thing. Red Mesa changed slowly during the following weeks. Vale's bank remained open under a federal examiner, so ordinary families would not lose their deposits. The water company gates were placed under joint guard, and no ranch could be cut off without Judge Cross's approval. For the first time in years, the public trough remained full from dawn until night. People approached it cautiously at first, still expecting a clerk to record their names or charge them by the bucket. Clara returned to the telegraph office before Miriam approved. She repaired the damaged key, spliced the northern wire, and transmitted a complete report to Santa Fe. The response arrived before noon. Territorial investigation authorized. Preserve all record. Clara copied the message and nailed it to the courthouse door, where Vale's punishment notice had once hung. Jonah spent much of his recovery in silence. Visitors came to thank him, apologize to Clara, or stare at the man they had known only through frightening newspaper stories. He disliked all three purposes. Tom Rusk brought a new saddle blanket and stood awkwardly beside the bed until Jonah finally said, You did not come to discuss wool. Tom looked down at his hat. I watched them tie her to that rail. Yes, I wanted to step forward. You did not. The rancher's face tightened. Jonah did not soften the truth. Wanting courage and choosing it are different things. Tom nodded. I know. Then remember that the next time someone stands alone. Tom left the blanket. Weeks later, Jonah learned he had been the first rancher to volunteer as a witness against Vale. When Amos became strong enough to sit upright, he asked Clara to visit. His room at Miriam's clinic faced the square, giving him a clear view of the sheriff's office he no longer entered. His badge lay inside a drawer beside the bed. Judge Cross has my confession, he said. Bribery, unlawful arrests, destruction of evidence, obstruction. I told him everything. Clara remained near the door, including the whipping, especially that. Amos's voice weakened. I thought if I controlled the punishment, I could keep Boone from killing you. You stood beside 5 men and called cruelty restraint. I know. He stared through the window. My wife wants me to ask you to speak for me. Clara waited. Will you? I will tell the court that you preserved records and finally confessed. I will also tell them how long you waited. Amos closed his eyes. That is fair. No, Clara said. It is accurate. Fairness is for the judge to decide. Horace Venn gave his formal statement 2 days later. He described every altered deed, every payment from Vale Bank, and every threat made against his family. He also identified the freight accounts used to fund the Bitter Creek ambush. His testimony matched Elias's ledger so precisely that federal examiners could trace the money from Vale's private accounts to Boone's men. When Venn finished, he asked Clara whether clearing her father's name changed how she answered him. It changes how the territory will remember him, she replied. I never believed the lie. Venn lowered his head. I helped preserve it. Yes, she did not offer absolution. Still, before leaving, she gave him paper and a pen so he could write the complete statement that would restore Elias Whitmore's professional record. Vale's trial began in Santa Fe 3 months later. Clara traveled with Miriam, Jonah, Amos, Venn, and several Drywell's ranchers. The courtroom was smaller than Vale expected and more crowded than he wanted. Without his bank, guards, and counsel, he appeared diminished, though not repentant. Boone testified that Vale had ordered the Bitter Creek ambush, instructed him to recover the map, and later paid men to attack Jonah's family. The copper plate established the true boundary. Elias's ledger established the payments. Amos's records linked Vale directly to the sheriff's office. The altered transfer Clara had signed was introduced as evidence of coercion. The coded spacing in her signature matched the telegraph message recorded by the Santa Fe operator. Vale's attorney argued that Boone, Amos, and Venn were criminals seeking lighter sentences. Clara agreed when called to testify. They are guilty, she told the court. That is why the records matter. Every one of them preserved something because he feared Mr. Vale would one day sacrifice him. Mr. Vale built his control by making each man believe he stood alone. The evidence shows they were all being used in the same design. Vale watched her from the defense table with the same pale hatred he had shown at the aqueduct. She did not look away. The jury convicted him of conspiracy to murder Elias Whitmore, land fraud, bribery, attempted murder, theft of public water rights, and obstruction of territorial justice. The court sentenced Vale to spend the remainder of his life in federal prison. His bank and water company assets were placed under administration, and the fraudulent mortgages against the Drywell's ranches were invalidated. Boone received a long prison sentence despite his cooperation. Amos and Venn both pleaded guilty. Their punishments were reduced because they had preserved evidence and testified, but neither man walked free. Amos served part of his sentence at a territorial work camp before leaving New Mexico with his wife and daughter. Venn was assigned to clerical labor under federal supervision. Before departing, he delivered a signed account declaring Elias Whitmore, an honest surveyor, murdered while protecting public land. When Clara returned to Red Mesa, the town council met inside the courthouse under temporary leadership. The members who had approved her punishment were required to resign. Their replacements voted to establish Mercy Spring as a public trust managed by 5 elected residents, with no private owner permitted to control access. Miriam accepted a seat on the board. Tom Rusk represented the Drywell's ranches. Clara was offered the position of record keeper and secretary. You will control every deed, payment, and water allotment, the new chairman said. Clara shook her head. I will record them. No single person should control them. She designed a system requiring 2 signatures for every transfer and public inspection of the books each month. The first entry she wrote stated that Mercy Spring belonged permanently to the people of Red Mesa. The council's apology came in the same square where Clara had been punished. Many residents expected a short statement and a quick end. Clara required every surviving councilman who had authorized the whipping to stand before the crowd. They admitted there had been no lawful warrant, no trial, and no legal power permitting 5 hired men to punish her. Some spoke from shame. Others seemed motivated by fear of further charges. Clara accepted the apology without pretending it repaired what happened. The danger was not only that Gideon Vale was cruel, she said. The danger was that ordinary people allowed his cruelty to appear lawful. She touched the scar beneath her collar. I will not hide what was done to me. I will also not let it become the only thing this town remembers about me. The old hitching rail still stood beside the public trough. Someone had suggested burning it during the ceremony. Clara refused. Fire removes the object, she said. It does not change its meaning. The rail was taken down and carried to a carpenter's shop. The strongest pieces were cleaned, cut, and built into the front step of a new school and telegraph office beside Mercy Spring. Children would cross the wood each morning to learn letters, numbers, maps, and the operation of the telegraph key. Jonah watched the work from across the road. That is a hard use for old timber, he said. Clara stood beside him. It held my weight once. Now it can hold theirs. By early autumn, Jonah's wound had healed enough for him to ride. He repaired his saddle, sharpened his tools, and packed his belongings without telling Clara. She found him at dawn near the western road, tightening the bedroll behind his saddle. You are leaving. It was not a question. Jonah kept his eyes on the buckle. Red Mesa has a federal marshal coming, a new sheriff to elect, and enough witnesses to keep Vale's men away. So your work is finished. The part requiring me is. Clara crossed her arms. You have become very skilled at deciding when other people no longer require you. He finally looked at her. You do not need a gunman standing between you and the world. Clara stepped closer. I never asked you to decide what I needed. Jonah looked toward Mercy Spring, where early light moved across the restored channel. My name will always bring someone searching for a reputation. Then they will discover Red Mesa is no longer governed by men who tolerate violence for entertainment. I bring old enemies. So does truth. He tried another argument. You deserve a peaceful life. Clara's expression hardened. Do not turn loneliness into a gift you are giving me. The words stopped him. She continued more quietly. I did not survive Vale, so another man could choose my future out of fear. Jonah rested one hand on the saddle. For 12 years, I believed staying near anyone was an act of selfishness. Rebecca and Samuel died and followed me home. They died because Vale ordered a crime. The guilt belongs to him and the men who obeyed. Knowing that does not make the graves disappear. No, Clara's voice softened. My father's name has been restored, but I still lost him. Justice does not reverse death. It tells us what we do with the life left afterward. She looked toward the western trail. I do not need you to rescue me. I want you to remain. Those are not the same thing. Jonah's guarded expression shifted. Remain as what? Clara almost smiled. You train horses. You repair roofs badly but persistently. Judge Cross has offered you work as a civilian investigator for the new county sheriff. High Mesa Station needs rebuilding. That is a considerable list. I have had time to prepare it. He stepped away from the saddle. And us? Clara held his gaze. We begin without lies. We work beside each other. We disagree frequently. That seems certain. And when fear tells either of us to leave, we speak before obeying it. Jonah removed the bedroll from his horse. It was not a proposal, declaration, or promise made beneath perfect circumstances. It was a decision to stay through imperfect ones. They rebuilt High Mesa Station over the next 6 months. The stone walls survived the fire, though the roof and stable required replacement. Jonah trained horses for ranch families and occasionally traveled with the new sheriff to investigate fraud or protect witnesses. Clara divided her time between the public records office and the station. A room near the front became a telegraph stop for travelers, making High Mesa part ranch, part relay post, and part refuge for anyone crossing the Western Road. Miriam claimed the cleanest room for medical emergencies and visited often enough to criticize the kitchen. Clara and Jonah argued over window placement, horse prices, and whether he had repaired the roof correctly. The arguments ended in solutions rather than silence. The autumn rains arrived during the dedication of the new school and telegraph office. The entire gathered in the square, beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds. The courthouse bell had been fitted with a new rope. Judge Cross returned to witness the formal transfer of Mercy Spring into public trust, and Elias Whitmore's name was engraved on a brass plaque beside the channel. Clara stood near the same place where Boone had once raised the whip. No rope bound her wrists, no hired men surrounded her. The scars beneath her dress remained, but they no longer belonged to Vale's version of her life. The bell rang. Its voice rolled over the roofs, the ranch road, and the water moving through the public trough. On the first note, Jonah stepped from the crowd. The motion echoed the day he had come forward, while everyone else remained still. This time he did not place himself between Clara and danger. He took his place beside her. Clara tied the faded red ribbon from Elias's ledger around the official public water deed and handed it to the elected trustees. Children ran through the shallow channel, laughing as rain began to darken the dust beneath their feet. Clara and Jonah crossed the square toward the schoolhouse. At the entrance, she paused on the step made from the old hitching rail. The wood had been sanded smooth, but she could still identify the grain, beneath which her hands had once been tied. A little girl hurried past carrying a slate and nearly collided with Jonah. He steadied her books and moved aside. Clara looked back across the square. Water flowed where the trough had once held sand. Families who had watched in silence now stood together beneath the rain. Jonah offered Clara his hand. She took it because she chose to, not because she could not stand without him. Above them, the bell continued to ring, and so Red Mesa was not saved by the fastest gun in the West alone. Jonah Rourke could stop a whip, defeat Boone Lasker, and stand between innocent people and violence, but no single bullet could restore what fear had taken from the town. Real justice began only when Clara Whitmore refused to surrender her voice, when witnesses chose truth over safety, and when ordinary townspeople finally understood that silence was helping the cruelest man among them remain powerful. Clara's greatest victory was not simply surviving the punishment Gideon Vale ordered. It was refusing to let that humiliation define the rest of her life. She transformed her father's hidden records into evidence, her pain into determination, and the very wood used to restrain her into the entrance of a school where future generations could learn. Her journey reminds us that being rescued from danger is not the same as being restored. Another person may protect us during our darkest moment, but dignity, purpose, and freedom must ultimately be reclaimed through our own choices. Jonah's journey carries a different lesson. For 12 years, he believed suffering alone was a form of atonement. He wandered because he thought everyone he loved would be safer without him. Yet isolation did not honor the family he lost, and revenge could not rebuild the life that had been destroyed. His true redemption came when he chose restraint over execution, witnesses over vengeance, and a shared future over endless punishment. Courage was not found only in drawing his revolver. It was found in lowering it when hatred gave him every reason to fire. The people of Red Mesa also learned that injustice rarely survives because one powerful man is invincible. It survives because many frightened people convince themselves that resistance belongs to someone else. Amos Bell surrendered his honor one compromise at a time. Horace Venn changed one number, then another, until an entire community lost its water and land. Each man told himself he was protecting his family, but fear became the chain Vale used to control them. Their eventual confessions mattered, but they did not erase their guilt. The story, therefore, asks us to remember that delayed courage can repair some damage, but it cannot make previous silence harmless. In the end, Mercy Spring flowed freely again because Clara, Jonah, Miriam, and the people of Red Mesa stopped standing separately. The town bell that once summoned citizens to witness cruelty later called them together to celebrate justice. Jonah no longer stood in front of Clara as her rescuer, he stood beside her as an equal. That may be the most important meaning of all. Love is not ownership, protection is not control, and healing does not require forgetting what happened. It means building something better from what remains. When injustice appears lawful, when fear encourages silence, or when powerful people demand obedience, the first person who steps forward may seem alone. But courage has a way of reminding others that they were never as powerless as they believed. Thank you for staying with Clara and Jonah until the final ringing of the bell. If their journey moved you, share the lesson you will remember most and join us for another story from the untamed American frontier. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.